Then in 1948, the Berlin airlift started. The Berlin airlift was when the Soviet Union wanted to spread communism, so they blockaded Berlin off from the Allies and from food and resources. The Allies retaliated by sending in airplanes to transport food and other resources. This started June 1948 and ended September 1949. Approximately 2 million tons of goods were transported into Berlin during the Berlin blockade. We have the NATO, which stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The NATO was established under the North Atlantic Peace Treaty on April 4, 1949. This organization represents the military peace between countries in Europe and America. The countries who joined immediately after it was established were Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Great Britain, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the US. Later, in 1952, Greece and Turkey also joined. Then in 1955, West Germany joined too. Later on, more countries joined. Now, there are 28 nations in the NATO. Our next event is the Korean War, which started 1950 and ended 1953. During the Korean War, the US, UN, and South Korea fought against China, the Soviet Union, and North Korea. Then, on May 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, which started the war. Then November 1950, South Korea, together with the US and UN, attacked back and almost conquered North Korea. But then in January 1951, there were many battles around the 38th parallel, which was the previous boundary in Korea. Then finally, August 1953, there's a ceasefire at the 38th parallel. In this war, North Korea was communist and South Korea was democratic. Still unclear who won the war, because when the war started, the boundaries of North Korea and South Korea were at the 38th parallel, and when they ended, it was at the 38th parallel. Then, just 2 years after the Korean War ended, another war started, the Vietnam War, which lasted all the way to 1975. Let's hear more about it. Then, in the Vietnam War, North Vietnam was communist, while South Vietnam was non-communist. The Vietnam War was when the South Vietnam attempted to stop the North Vietnam from taking over the country. Finally, America joined the South Vietnam, while China and the USSR, so the Soviet Union, joined North Korea. This was, in fact, the longest war the US was ever involved in. In the end, North Vietnam won, and Vietnam is now one of the few countries that is still communist. Then in 1960, we had the U-2 incident. In the U-2 incident, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over the USSR in May 1960. Eisenhower accepted responsibility when he was accused of sending the spy plane. He even admitted that the plane had been making pictures of the Soviet Union for years. However, the president refused to apologize. This incident worsened relations for the US and the Soviet Union greatly. Then in 1961, a year after the U-2 incident, we had the Bay of Pigs invasion. Let's hear about the Bay of Pigs invasion. In the Bay of Pigs invasion, the US sponsored an invasion to bring down the Cuban government, which was communist, in April 1961. However, this invasion was poorly planned and it failed. All this accomplished was that it worsened relations with the USSR, and strengthen communist power in Cuba. Then, again, in 1961, the Berlin Wall was erected. To be exact, the Berlin Wall was actually built on August 13th, 1961. This was when the Soviets divided East Berlin from West Berlin. After World War II, Berlin was actually divided into four parts. One belonged to Great Britain, one belonged to France, one to the US, and one to the Soviet Union. 31 years later, when the wall fell, it didn't only fall, but it also symbolized the collapse of Soviet influence in Europe. The Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain was mentioned in a speech by the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Churchill delivered this speech after it was clear what the USSR was planning, which was to spread communism all over the world. And this phrase refers to the Soviet Union's isolation policy. As we have here, this big fat red line represents all the countries that the USSR has already taken control of. The Marshall Plan was one program that aimed to undermine communism, and so was the Truman Doctrine. We have Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He was the British Prime Minister not once but twice. First from 1940 to 1945, and then from 1951 to 1955. After his death, the Queen even granted him the honor of a state funeral. While during his life, he helped the Allies in World War II. He was famous for his great spirit, and he was even awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was also famous for his Iron Curtain speech, which he gave on March 1946. And then in 1962 we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, just 1 year after the Bay of Pigs invasion. Cuban Missile Crisis was when the Soviet Union, together with Cuba, built bases in Cuba that could fire nuclear missiles directly into America. But however, this was just a countermeasure to America's bases around the Soviet Union, mainly in Greece and Turkey. In the end, both the US and the Soviet Union were forced to abandon these bases by the UN. We are no longer in danger of the Soviets, and we are no longer in danger of Cuban missiles, nuclear or non-nuclear. And then in 1991, at the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union collapsed. This collapse started in January 1991, when citizens started protesting. And instead of fighting the protesters, the military actually joined the rebels. By December, 15 countries had declared their independence all around the now Russia. As a last resort, communist officials tried to stop the process with the August coup. However, that failed. There was still a Communist Party, and they actually came close to winning other elections. However, finally, in April 2002, the Communist Party was dissolved, and there was no more communism in Russia. Our last event is communism today, and all these red countries are still communist. Only these red countries are still communist. Did you know that there are only 5 more countries with communist governments? They are China, North Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, and Laos. Now, when I say communism, you might automatically think that's a really bad way to rule a government, to rule a country. But over time, a variety of forms of communism have developed. Some may be better than others. In America, there's no more national fear of communism. The Second Red Scare has ended. Containment doesn't exist anymore. And the Cold War ended in 1991. It's true that the American government is still anti-communist, but it would never attack nations with nuclear weapons for only being ruled by a communist government. And that's it. So, a couple last things that I'd like you to know is that now the most important thing that you've learned is that communism isn't bad. It's not some horrible disease or something. And that communism isn't an active threat these days. It's the second Red Scare has ended. So please don't use those chemical weapons we found you with on communist countries because they may not be as bad as you might think they are. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.